Hi, thanks for tuning in. This is the US Futures weekly chart analysis for the week ending 25th of July 2025. The first chart is the US dollar index futures. You can see the market pulled back this week after just popping its head into the longer term trading range last week. It wasn't able to maintain its position there this week and pretty much pulled back immediately the week opened. Price has not broken down. We'd mark the breakdown line here. So price has pulled back and is still trading in the shadow of the longer term trading range, attempting to hold on to some extent. You can see that volume reduced as price pulled back this week. Spread wasn't really narrower, but it did close well off the week's lows, which was of some benefit for sure. I would consider this market's flirting with danger, and it looks weaker than stronger. The fact that it could only push up to the longer term trading range just briefly for one bar before it pulled back immediately suggests this market is probably going to push lower. That is yet to be confirmed, but it's certainly vulnerable to the downside at this point in time. The next chart is the E-mini S&P. This is S&P 500 index futures. And you can see the market pushed higher this week. After a fortnight in consolidation mode, as price challenged the highs of the range here, the market has moved higher this week, albeit on reduced volume and with a relatively narrow spread. So there was no great confirmation of a push higher this week. Prices really just floated higher on a lack of selling pressure rather than with real underlying intent. And when that happens, any sign of weakness that emerges sees a market like this retreat very quickly and easily because there's no real oomph behind the market's push higher. So at this point, the market has just floated higher on reduced supply rather than real buying intent. The next chart is the 10-year note futures. And price pushed higher this week, but found it difficult to move above this intermediate level here. The market attempted to move through that level, but eventually price pulled back to close right at the important level here. There was a brief and shallow test for supply earlier in the week before the market did attempt to push higher. And you can see that volume reduced this week, and it was below the previous 4 weeks' volume. And that's a good indication that there was no real strength behind the move higher this week. Price just floated up higher and then drifted lower into the close. There was no great intent being shown by the market. Overall, the market's trading within this broad range, which I don't expect will see the market trend in any direction until it's either exceeded or price fails and moves below. The next chart are copper price futures, and copper price futures did push higher this week. There was only 1 week of consolidation, which was a little surprising. I thought it might have gone on for a little longer than that. Price did push up. It briefly challenged the highs of the range, this bar's high, before just drifting back and closing in the safety of the previous up bar's range. This was still quite a strong bar, and overall, these 3 bars are showing you this market is moving higher. It's not in any sort of weakness at all. If there was any weakness in this market, it would have been shown this week following last week's test for supply. And this week, price briefly tested below the previous bar's close with a very narrow spread before pushing higher with some intent on relatively low volume, so that's showing you that selling pressure was low in the market before the price just drifted lower to close back within this up bar's range, but still as a decent sized up bar. And this market's certainly showing more strength than weakness. Next chart is gold price futures. And gold price futures made an attempt to push higher this week on an increase in volume. It did see some supply drawn out, and in response, price pulled back. You've still got the market attempting to push higher overall, but the fact that supply was drawn out this week will probably see this market test for supply at least early next week, like this. It'll have a relatively narrow spread to begin with, and if supply is drawn out, it'll pull back a little more deeply. If the market does pull back and supply is not drawn out, you might see the market make a secondary attempt to push higher. But at this point, I would expect the market to pull back with a shallow spread early in the week and just see if that supply is really going to be drawn out and chase price down, or if supply will dry up almost immediately and the supply is sitting right up here at the breakout line. The silver price futures. Silver price futures also made an attempt to move higher this week, up here, before seeing some supply drawn out, similar to the gold market, and price settled slightly lower for the week. Still within the previous bar's range quite comfortably. You've got the market trading in a range like this at the moment. I would expect, similar to the gold price futures, that price will pull back a little bit early in the week and just test for supply. If supply is drawn out, that pullback might be a little deeper. If supply is found to be low, I would expect the market to reverse during the week and push up a little higher and just see how much supply is drawn out if price moves higher in response a second time. Next chart is light crude price futures, which after a couple of weeks of exaggerated spreads have settled down again now for the last month and are trading roughly sideways above this down bar's lows. Volumes have normalised back to just a little below the average. Spreads have normalised, more like average spreads or even slightly below average spreads. And price is attempting to consolidate on top of this level here, where the market broke out from down here. You can see that spread narrowed this week on below average volume, which does show you that there was some minor buying support in the market this week. Certainly wasn't overwhelming and it certainly wasn't particularly strong, but the reduced spread does suggest that some buying support has emerged this week. I'm expecting price to continue trading above this breakdown line. I'm not expecting price to really accelerate higher or anything like that. Into the currencies now. This is the Euro US dollar currency pair. Price moved higher this week after testing the highs of that range for strength. The next level would come through there like that. So you can see prices move back up to that level and close just below it. Volume was below average and slightly reduced over the previous bar's volume. You see the little bit of buying support emerged off last week's bar's low, and in response, prices moved higher and back up to the highs of the range. This market appears to be looking to push higher, and it'll do so if there's further weakness in the US dollar. British pound currency futures. And this market attempted to push higher and failed to some degree, and saw some supply drawn out. Volume was low, so this market has not had enough buying support emerge to maintain a higher price. The price has drifted back lower after initially attempting to push higher. The market's drifted back lower on a lack of support in the market. So that's actually a change in sentiment, or maybe may prove to be a change in sentiment over time. Here's the highs of the range we're looking at. Price hasn't pushed back down to that level yet. This market was leading the euro. The euro's back at this level here. This market's pushed up to that level and failed and drifted lower in response on low volume, lack of demand. So we'll see if there's a change in sentiment in this market with the response next week. Generally looking at that, you would see a test for supply early next week, narrower spread, a brief pullback to challenge any sellers in the market, and then an attempt to push higher if supply is found to be low. So we'll see how that works out next week. Next chart is the Japanese yen currency futures. They saw a little support emerge this week. Price was threatening to break down last week. They did see some support emerge this week. Price did push higher before drifting back down to close about mid-bar. Volume remained below average and slightly lower than the previous week. So there was no great buying support in the market. The market was floating around to some degree. It floated higher and then drifted lower without any great intent being shown, with lower volume and below average volume. That suggests this market is likely to travel sideways in response. There's not enough weakness in the market to break price down and move lower, down to this level. But there doesn't seem to be a great deal of demand in the market either. You're going to have overhead resistance at this level, so I would expect the market to trade in this sort of range next week. Final currency chart is the Aussie dollar currency futures, which pushed back up this week and into this range again. This is like an absorption period, and the market has been trading within that range for some time now. There's some levels to the left which the market is just grinding its way through, absorbing its way through. The next higher serious level comes through here, which isn't yet in play. The market responded nicely after pulling back last week. It pushed up to the highs of the range before closing about mid-bar. Similar to the previous chart, volumes were reduced and are well below average. So the market floated higher this week on a lack of selling pressure and then just drifted lower for a mid-bar close, not showing any great intent. I would expect the market to continue trading within this range next week. The next chart are Bitcoin futures. Bitcoin futures traded just slightly lower this week in consolidation following the previous week where price pushed higher and failed and drifted lower. So you've got the market trading in this sort of range. This up bar is still quite valid. Price is remaining well above its lows. This is the all-time highs here. So the market has effectively broken out and it's in consolidation mode, just seeing how much supply is going to be drawn out and attempting to absorb that supply as it is being drawn out. This is a pretty good job, to be honest, considering the supply that was drawn out last week. You would have expected the market to come back a little more deeply this week and challenge the sellers. Instead, the market's remained right up high in the range, and it's done a good job to absorb the supply that has been drawn out in that range. Volume reduced to about average. I would expect you'll probably see a little test for supply early next week below the previous bar's close. And if supply is found to be low, there's a good chance the market will attempt to push higher in response next week and break out to new highs. So look for an early test for supply next week, just below the previous bar's close, which is effectively at 117.5 in here. And if supply is found to be low on a relatively narrow spread pullback, I would expect the market to make an attempt to push higher if trading conditions are at all favourable. And just back to US dollar index futures, just quickly, you can see how the market pushed up into the longer term trading range 2 weeks ago. It wasn't able to maintain that position there, and it's drifted lower this week. It hasn't challenged the lows of the range here, which are the last gasp lows you might expect. And I would expect there will be some attempt to hold on in this level here. It may be a failed attempt eventually, but there'll be an attempt to hold on at least sometime this week prior to any total failure and breakdown, which I think may come at a later date. Okay, thanks for your time. See you again next week. See ya.